Hello and welcome to my Triumvirate Shadow Mage build guide. In this video I'll be going over the spells in the Shadow Mage archetype of the mod, some key perks to take, attribute distribution, synergy with Vampirism, gear and enchantments, alchemy recipes, and finally some fun gameplay combinations to try in your own playthrough. I've also included timestamps so you can easily skip to any section if you're looking for something specific. Before getting started on the actual build guide, I thought it would be best to mention some key mods in my load order. In addition to Triumvirate Mage Archetypes, I'm using the full Skyrim suite, including, but not limited to, Ordinator, Perks of Skyrim, Apocalypse, Magic of Skyrim, and Sacrosanct, Vampires of Skyrim. I'm running many more mods, but these are the key ones for this build. You can find a link to my mod watch page below, which has an exhaustive list of all the mods in my game. If you have any more questions regarding mods, feel free to ask in the comments below. I'm happy to answer to the best of my ability. First, let's take a look at the alteration spells. Shadow Stride is a novice spell that gives you a temporary 15% buff to movement speed in combat. It's a nice buff, increasing evasiveness and enabling a quick warrior archetype. But movement speed can be boosted via enchantments and perks later in the game. Still, this spell is nice to have early on, and it works best hooked up to Okado's Recital so that it's auto-cast when entering combat. Step Through Shadows is an apprentice spell that zips you to a target up to 150 feet away, reducing their armor briefly. This is one of my favorite spells of the entire package. You'll want to be casting this spell constantly once you obtain it. The spell greatly enables the extreme mobility that is a trademark of the Shadow Mage. Shadow Dance is an adept spell that allows you to temporarily dash up to 20 feet for a small amount of magicka. This is another great spell which expands mobility. I kept this one hooked up to Okado's Recital for the duration of my playthrough. Being able to zip around the battlefield at will is a rush. Instead of zipping you to a target, Pull Through Shadows is an expert spell that zips the target to you. This would be useful for kiting single enemies away from a group, but this spell seems to have a pretty strong area of effect to it, and it will often pull entire groups to it. It's still useful, but Step Through Shadows is both more magicka efficient and more fun, in my opinion. Nightgate is a master level spell that allows you to place 2 portals that you can freely travel between. This is quite useful for bridging long gaps and providing escape routes in outnumbered infiltration situations. Next, we'll look at the destruction spells. Draining Touch is a novice spell that zaps your enemy with an instant hit scan detection shot, and transfers health and magicka from them to you over a moderate amount of time. This is a great spell that scales really well with your destruction skill and remains viable throughout an entire playthrough. As with all shadow destruction spells, this is non-elemental, so you don't have to worry as much about resistant enemies. Ozra's Wrath is an apprentice level spell that casts a strong area of effect explosion centered on the player character. It converts 50% of your current magicka into damage, so the higher your magicka pool, the stronger the spell. But the more magicka you use up, the less damage it does. This spell works best when you are at or near full magicka. Nightblade is an adept level spell that is self-targeted, but on melee attack, it will zip you to your target, converting 50% of your current magicka into damage. As with Ozra's Wrath, it's best used at or near full magicka. On paper, this seems like it would be a cornerstone of the Shadow Mage, but in execution, it's a bit unreliable. At times, it just doesn't trigger on melee attack, and in third-person view, it's very hard to target the enemy properly. Still, it's far too powerful and cool to ignore, so I hooked it up to Okado's Recital and left it there for the entirety of my playthrough. Draining Shroud is an expert spell that absorbs health and magicka from nearby enemies for a moderate amount of time. It's similar to Draining Touch, but in cloak form. This is a very powerful spell to hook up to Okado's Recital. Be warned, however, that this can break your game, melting health bars at high levels before you even get a chance to play. Draining Myst is a master spell that casts a very large field that absorbs a large amount of health and magicka over a moderate amount of time. It's useful for large groups or powerful enemies, but carries with it the slow casting and recovery times of all master spells. And finally, let's look at the illusion spells. Gather Shadows is a novice spell that buffs your melee attacks and Shadow Mage spells while in darkness. The damage buff here is quite large, up to 50% in full darkness. So I hooked this up to Okado's Recital immediately and left it there for the entirety of my playthrough. Darkness is an apprentice level spell that creates a small source of darkness attached to a surface for a moderate amount of time. This would work well with Gather Shadows, but at least in a sneaky infiltration scenario, the execution isn't great. Instead of manipulating the environment, it seems to affect enemy targets directly, which alerts them and causes them to look for the player character. This often leads the target to move outside of the limited radius of the darkness spell. To make this effective, you'd need to cast the spell, enter combat, and try to lead your enemy back into the area of effect for an open battle. I had much more fun just trying to stay in areas of natural darkness during infiltrations and fights. Reveal Secrets is an adept spell that illuminates containers, doors, and keys in a fairly wide area for a level-scaled period of time. This could be useful, but at higher levels it makes a glowy mess of your screen for a very long period of time. In my opinion, this spell would work much better as a concentration spell. As it stands, to make this useful, you'll want to use this only out of combat, and then wait an hour in-game so the effect can expire before you move on. Possession is an expert level spell with which an affected enemy will fight for the player upon dying, getting a damage buff for the duration. This was one of my favorite spells to play with and was especially fun when an affected enemy was decapitated. I loves me some headless minions. I found this to be effective hooked up to the Spellscribe perk ability, allowing the player to cast this with a melee power attack. This allows tagging an enemy from a distance, and stronger enemies that survive a power attack will automatically be tagged. Nightfall is a master spell that spawns a pool of darkness that follows you for a moderate period of time. You'll gain all Shadow Mage buffs, including the full darkness damage buff. You'll want to cast this before entering combat with bosses and tough enemies. For the Shadow Mage, the perks you take will largely rely on how you want to play. I play it as a shadowy ninja warrior, using sneak and shadow spells to get the upper hand, and then relying on melee skills once enemies were alerted. This led me to taking perks in lots of different skills, so the build really didn't hit its stride until somewhere between level 30 and 40. If you play as more of a dagger assassin, you'll be able to skip the warrior skills and focus your build a bit more on stealth. My build ended up incorporating many skills, and most of the perks I took were pretty obvious. So I'll limit this section to just the most interesting and important key perks for the build. First, let's take a look at the alteration perks. The Spellblade perk gives a 20% attack damage buff for 4 seconds whenever you cast a spell with one hand. Since I often found myself using Step Through Shadows to dash to an enemy and immediately whacking them with my blade, this felt like a no-brainer. A 20% damage buff is no joke at any level. Vancian Magic. This perk removes magicka costs from all spells and makes all spells twice as effective, but enforces a restricted spell count. Once you've used up all your spells, you can no longer cast until you sleep at an inn or an owned home. This perk will completely transform a mage playthrough. But with 2 of our key spells' effectiveness tied directly to current magicka levels, this will allow us to use Ozra's Wrath and Nightblade at full strength as rapidly as we want to cast them. You'll also want to take the Quadratic Wizard perk, which scales your spell count with your magicka pool size every time you rest. Since we'll be investing heavily in magicka, this will increase the amount of spells we can cast before we run out. The Dungeon Master perk is worth taking if you want to play more of a warrior type like me. I choose the Focused option, which makes spells more powerful but reduces the available count. Then, once I'm out of spells, my weapon damage is buffed. If you plan to play more of an assassin archetype, this may not be as useful. In the block tree, if you like to dabble in melee combat, I found the Quick Reflexes perk to fit the speedy ninja playstyle quite well. You can ignore this if you want to play more as an assassin type. In the destruction tree, you'll mainly want to focus on the mastery and raw power perks. The shadow spells are fairly strong on their own, but once perked, they become all the way OP. There are a couple perks worth taking in the enchanting tree, even if you don't plan on crafting. The Spellscribe perk is useful for any build, allowing you to hook up a spell to your power attacks. You must be able to dual cast the spell though, so you'll need a perk for that as well. The other perk is Might and Magic. If you have a spell in one hand and a melee weapon in the other, it buffs both by 10% at all times. In the illusion tree, beyond the mastery perks, you'll want to take both levels of the Silent Storm perk. This will make both spellcasting and shouts silent, which is useful for both the assassin and warrior subtypes, and absolutely necessary for the assassin. Light armor is more useful for the warrior subtype, and most perks will help there. However, the Evasive Leap perk, coupled with the Shadow Dance spell, results in one of my favorite combos for this build. Just imagine dashing invincibly through the air in the midst of an epic battle. You'll want to invest fairly heavily in the one-handed skill regardless of subtype. Assassins will want to focus on daggers, while warriors will want to focus more on swords. Of course, either will want furious strength for those sweet, sweet decapitations. Sneak is useful for both subtypes, but you'll want to invest more heavily for the assassin. All perks are useful here, but one interesting standout is Smokescreen. The fog it creates in-game fits nicely with the Shadow Magic aesthetic, and the blinding effect enables some very cool combos with some of the damage over time spells. Another perk that fits the teleport theme is Laughing Ghost. It's a lesser power that you can trigger at will, teleporting you behind the target to attempt a power attack for double sneak damage. This has game-breaking potential on its own, so use sparingly if you actually want to play the game. Now for a quick word on how to increase your attributes with each level up. For the Assassin subtype, you can focus almost exclusively on magicka, with a little bit of health and stamina as needed at early levels. You should be relying on your stealth skill for defense, leaving you with lots of magicka for offense. For the Warrior subtype, I simply took the attribute with the lowest value at each level, until my health and stamina were at a level that I felt they were no longer an overt liability to my survivability. Then, in late game, I focused entirely on magicka to boost spell count and power. With the Sacrosanct mod, there are lots of reasons that make turning your Shadow Mage into a vampire a great decision. First, with the Gather Shadows spell, you'll be wanting to spend as much time in darkness as possible to buff your spell and melee power. This helps cover the vampire's weakness to sunlight, since you are already avoiding it anyway. Second, you've already taken the raw power perks in the destruction tree for your shadow spells. These perks will also boost your hemomancy spells, making them a very powerful way to supplement your arsenal. Next, there are some very cool abilities granted through Sacrosanct that fit well with the Shadow Mage theme. Nightwalk allows you to move about in mist form, returning to your original location after 15 seconds, or firing the power again to teleport to your current location. Wicked Wind allows you to dash directly to a target location at will via a lesser power. Obfuscate provides unbreakable invisibility for 60 seconds. Sneak attacks and activating items will not cause you to lose invisibility during this time. And finally, just for being a vampire, you'll get a buff of 25% to your illusion spells and sneak ability, both of which are heavily used by the Shadow Mage. The only drawback is you'll need to make sure you're keeping well fed and out of the sunlight. Sacrosanct is extremely fun even on its own, and I highly recommend it to anyone who enjoys playing vampire characters. Gear considerations will be heavily influenced by playstyle. For the warrior subtype, I invested in some cool looking light armor, and the perks, and wakizashis as my chosen weapon. I just thought that the smaller Japanese styled blades really fit well with the ninja aesthetic rather than daggers or larger weapons. Ultimately, this aesthetic probably was the key decider in my choice to play a hybrid warrior class instead of a more pure assassin. Assassins will choose daggers, which are silent, and you may also opt for robes or clothing in place of light armor, as you won't need as much protection if you're staying hidden all the time. This should allow you to narrow your focus on fewer skill trees. As for specific enchantments, from the Summer Myst Enchantments of Skyrim mod, Amplify Destruction is very powerful. Otherwise, Fortify Magicka for the damage boost to Nightblade and Ozra's Wrath is a solid option. Beyond that, the enchantments will be fairly obvious based on your playstyle. For warriors, you'll want to focus on increasing armor, magic resistance, and one-handed. For assassins, you'll want to focus on sneak, sneak attack, and muffle enchantments. As for weapon enchantments, why restrict yourself? One nice benefit of using light weapons like daggers and wakizashis is that you can carry several without encumbrance being a concern. You can switch between them as the need arises based on enemy type whenever you need. In my opinion, the Shadow Mage build is wide enough that you should not add alchemy to the skills that you invest perks into. However, there are a few potions that are effective at low to mid levels even with no perks. The first of these is the Paralysis Damage Health Potion, using Imp Stool, Canis Root, and Mora Tapanella. Each of these ingredients are plentiful if you know where to find them, and inexpensive if you find them at a vendor. They are also plantable for mass production. At early levels, this can be a lifesaver. Having a stock of potions that instantly paralyze your enemy while also doing damage over time is quite useful. The next one is great at all levels. It both fortifies magicka and amplifies destruction damage, giving your shadow spells a double boost. It consists of Ectoplasm, Nightshade, and Red Mountain Flower. While Nightshade and Red Mountain Flowers are widely available and plantable, Ectoplasm is much harder to come by. You can clear Randvegs fast, and Ingvild of the ghosts that haunt those areas to farm this ingredient though. It may not seem like much, but it's surprising just how much this potion will buff your spells with no investment from the alchemy tree. And now for the fun stuff. In this section, I'll put some of these concepts together in sequences that yield powerful and fun results. I also give them cute little names because I grew up on fighting games and have a soft spot for special moves. The first combo is called Umbral Shift. Basically, by taking the Evasive Leap perk and setting Shadow Dance to cast automatically at the start of combat via Okado's Recital, whenever you enter combat, you gain access to a highly mobile dodge mechanic. This is also an extremely effective way of traversing the battlefield to maintain tactical advantage. This is obviously more useful for the warrior subtype than the assassin, but it fits the theme and playstyle really well. Next, we have the Shadow Warhead. This combo makes use of Step Through Shadows and Ozra's Wrath. From a safe vantage point, pre-cook Ozra's Wrath by casting and holding it. Then cast Step Through Shadows at a group of enemies. Just as you recover from the dash, let go of Ozra's Wrath for a powerful blast of shadow magic to all in the area. If you've perked your destruction skill correctly, this should wipe out all foes in one shot. If not, one more Ozra's Wrath blast at full strength, due to Vancian magic, should clean them up. it may be prudent to be ready with a Become Ethereal shout in case you happen to kick a hornet's nest. The next special combo is one I like to call Creeping Death. Metallica fans out there will get the reference. For this combo, you'll use Draining Shroud and Smokescreen. From a safe spot, sneak in as close as you can to a group of enemies and trigger the Smokescreen power from the Ordinator Sneak perk. Then, cast Draining Shroud and slowly weave yourself amongst your confused enemies, watching their health bars melt away along with your stress. And finally, the big boy, Umbral Detonation. We'll use the Ghostwalk spell from Apocalypse Spells of Skyrim alongside Draining Myst to plant a massive dirty shadow bomb in the middle of a group of enemies. Draining Myst is a master spell that takes forever to cast and recover from, normally leaving you vulnerable in the process. However, Ghostwalk will give us cover before, during, and after the spellcasting animation to make it safe. To pull this off, from a safe vantage point, cast Ghostwalk. Make your way to the center of the enemy congregation and cast Draining Myst. The invisibility from Ghostwalk should keep you from being detected while the spell warms up, and after release, you'll be teleported out of the danger zone and back to the safety of your original vantage point. Now just watch as your enemy's health bars are deleted. And that does it for the Triumvirate Shadow Mage build and gameplay guide. I worked really hard on this and I'm very proud of it. I really hope you like it too and that it was useful. If so, please let me know by liking and subscribing so I know to make more of these in the future. Until then, bye everybody.